The big picture is this. If the Democrats are going to retake the House next November, they need to be able to vote. And the Trump administration's Commission on what they call electoral integrity is working to make that a lot harder. For an update, we turn to our man on voting rights, Ari Berman. He wrote the award-winning book, Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. He's been a senior contributing writer at The Nation magazine and a fellow at the Nation Institute. He also writes for the New York Times, Rolling Stone, The Guardian. He's a frequent guest and commentator on MSNBC and NPR. Ari, welcome back.
Hey, John. Good to talk to you again.
Well, let's start with what we've learned about Russian hacking of voting in the election last November. That's the subject of your cover story in the new issue of The Nation magazine. What have we learned?
Well, there's still a lot we don't know, but what intelligence agency officials have testified is that Russian hackers attempted to infiltrate and targeted 21 different states' election systems. So again, we don't know exactly what that means. We don't know if they got into voter registration rolls. We don't know what, if anything, they were able to do with voting machines. 2 states have been identified where hackers were successful. One was Illinois, where they were able to steal the records of 90,000 registered voters, and the other was Arizona, where they attempted to breach the registration list via a county-level infiltration. So I would like us to be able to know more about this. I would like there to be more declassified information about what actually happened. But clearly this is just the first step, I think, in hackers becoming more acquainted with the American election system and preparing. What I'm worried about is that they're now trying to prepare for an even broader attack on our election systems in 2018 or 2020.
Hacking into 21 different states' election systems, how does this compare with hacking John Podesta's emails or the DNC emails, which, of course, were posted on WikiLeaks at that key moment in the campaign?
Well, I view the hacking of election systems as a far more serious threat because emails are one thing. Things that people use to register to vote or to vote on get to the heart of America's election process, and whether Russia did it this time or someone else does it another time, what my piece looked at is just how vulnerable our system is, how insecure our voting systems and other stuff are, how easy it would be for hackers to try to access registration data, how they could change voters' information to screw up the rolls in any number of ways. For example, like in states with strict voter ID laws, where your driver's license or some other photo identification has to match on your name on your voting rolls almost exactly. If you just changed 1 or 2 letters in everyone's name, that could prevent thousands of people from being able to cast a regular ballot. So these are the kind of nightmare scenarios that I'm worried about, and that a lot of other people who study American election systems are worried about as well.
Well, the little that we know about this includes a statement from our intelligence agencies saying no votes were changed or altered by Russian hacking. Do you think that's true?
Well, there's no evidence that any votes were changed, but unfortunately there's not any evidence to suggest that they weren't changed either, meaning that DHS said they had not conducted a forensic analysis of any of the voting machines. I asked multiple election experts how confident they were that no votes were changed, and what they told me was it's impossible to know, which isn't to suggest a conspiracy theory that somehow all of these voting machines were hacked. What it is to say is that 14 states vote on electronic voting machines with no paper trails. So if there was a hacking, it might be very difficult to detect it. Meanwhile, the other 36 states have some sort of paper backup, but they don't check that paper regularly enough to compare the results. So we have some basic protections in place, but if we were really targeted with a massive cyber attack on our election systems, we are very, very vulnerable. And given what happened in 2016, it's extremely disturbing we haven't done anything to protect our election system going forward.
Are we sure that the Russians did it? Trump has tweeted, quote, "I strongly pressed President Putin twice about Russian meddling in our election. He vehemently denied it," close quote. Your comment.
Well, that's like asking a mobster if he killed someone. He's probably not going to admit it unless he absolutely has to. I have no reason to dispute what the intelligence community is saying about this. Their findings are unanimous that it was the Russians. Meanwhile, intelligence officials going to Capitol Hill and saying it was the Russians while they're serving in the Trump administration puts them at great personal risk. So people from the FBI, people from the Department of Homeland Security, people from the CIA who are currently serving in the government, when they're testifying that it was Russia that hacked us, that's only going to make Trump angry. So if anything, they have a built-in incentive to say it wasn't the Russians, and they're saying quite the opposite.
You said that one of the things that an adversary could do would be to change the voter registration rolls to in states where strict ID is required that would prevent thousands of people from voting. Would it be possible, or what would it take to prevent Russians from changing the actual results on the machines? How hard would it be for us to prevent that from happening?
It would be harder, but not impossible, to access the machine. So the registration lists sit on a bunch of different computers, so it's easier to hack the registration list. The machines themselves are not connected to the internet, but what I learned reporting this piece is that when the machines are programmed, because you have to program every machine, they often are connected to computers that are connected to the internet. So that's how you'd have to do it, or you'd have to physically get access to some of these machines. So it's more difficult, but certainly not impossible for someone who has a lot of technological sophistication with hacks.
I read that 42 states use Windows XP for their voting system. I think we were supposed to stop using Windows XP in 2014. Have I got that right?
Well, so a bunch of voting machines were bought after the 2000 election in Florida, after the hanging chad and butterfly ballot debacle. And these machines were supposed to last for 10 to 15 years, meaning they have all basically expired by now. But states haven't spent money to buy new voting machines. And this is extremely problematic because, first off, the old software is totally primitive. It's easier to hack. And second thing, I mean, it could just melt down regardless of a hack. If machines break down, that leads to long lines, that leads to skepticism about the results, that leads to difficulty counting the results accurately. We saw this in Detroit in the last election where tons of machines just broke down. Like a third of the city had broken down voting machines, and it led to big problems on election day. So I think it's absolutely insane that we're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on a quote-unquote election integrity commission when there's no evidence of voter fraud whatsoever in American elections, but we can't even get a few $1 million to the states to upgrade their voting machines and create a paper trail. I mean, it's totally unconscionable.
Yeah, the figures that I saw in the New York Times was replacing all the old electronic voting machines that produce no paper trail. That's 14 states, according to the New York Times, with new machines that would have auditable returns would cost something like $130 million, maybe as much as $400 million. Is that a lot in terms of the federal budget?
It's not a lot in terms of the federal budget, and it's certainly not a lot when our elections cost billions of dollars, and we don't even have confidence that the machines that are counted in will work accurately or will not be hacked. So to me, this needs to be the number one priority.
Well, luckily for us, we already have a presidential commission charged with investigating election integrity and recommending ways to improve it. This is the President's Commission, headed by Mike Pence and Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach. What's your assessment of their work at this point?
Well, my assessment of the commission is that it's totally pointless. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest that millions of people voted illegally, as Donald Trump tweeted, and that's the only reason we have this commission in the first place, and it's focused on the absolutely wrong problem. We should be looking at election hacking and the vulnerability of our voting system, and also at voter suppression laws all across the country that made it harder to vote in 2016 and their impact on voter participation. We've had many studies now of voter fraud. It's an extremely rare problem in American elections. To the extent that it occurs, it's regularly caught. Election officials themselves will say this is not a big problem. We have much bigger problems. And my fear is that the Election Integrity Commission is going to spread this gigantic lie about voter fraud, which is that millions of people voted illegally, or at least a very large number of people voted illegally. And then because of that, we have to put in place all of these steps that make it more difficult to vote, all of these new restrictions to make it more difficult to vote, while doing nothing to actually make our election system more secure and actually preserve the integrity of our election systems, which many people are doubting after the 2016 election.